Welcome to the Belarus Factor, the podcast where politics, power, and real talk about Belarus collide. I'm Ivan Kravtsov, broadcasting from exile and bringing you the truth behind the headlines. Hey everyone, and very welcome to the first episode of the podcast Belarus Factor. We decided to introduce this series to cover events about Belarus around it, inside it, in various domains, economics, culture, but mostly politics, because we think it's important to spread the word about Belarus. I, Ivan Kravtsov, was born in Belarus 35 years ago, lived most of my life there. I was doing architecture and real estate, mostly, just before 2020, when I have joined the campaign headquarters of the most popular presidential candidate, Viktor Babarika, and then after he was arrested, worked with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the campaign of three women, Kolesnikova Veronika and Tikhanovskaya, who were the symbol of the protest movement in 2020. I'm also part of the democratic movement in exile, being a secretary of the Coronation Council, the umbrella organization for the opposition in exile, since 2020. The other thing that we plan to do is to invite some experts, the friend experts, which are really good at some specific topics. We plan to invite some people who are monitoring the public opinion in Belarus, the people who are thinking about the security issues connected to Belarus, the people who are thinking about legal issues, the human rights defenders. So expect a lot of guests during the episodes of this podcast, and all these guests will be the one that I really trust, the one that I think have the best expertise, the best experience in the field that we will be discussing. And today I would like to talk about the Belarusian 2025 presidential elections, which actually happening on January 26, 2025, very soon. This is the seventh presidential election campaign, and usually it brings much more attention inside the country because Belarus is a very the system where there is a lot of power which is concentrated in the hands of the president, so naturally people perceive presidential elections as something really important. There are like 5 registered candidates running for election. It doesn't really matter, and why I will tell you a moment later. The election process is pretty simple, so every citizen aged 18 plus is eligible to vote. There are around 7 million voters which are registered in Belarus, 6.9 million, so to say. The campaign is happening on a very short timeline, so it's just 2 months for the campaign. So I think just end of December, the Electoral Commission started to work. There were like a couple of weeks for the candidates to promote themselves, and then the vote will be held on January 26, as I said. Why do we really talk about the elections in Belarus? Almost every time that Belarus have had elections, this is a milestone for a political season. So it doesn't matter if elections are free or unfree, there is almost always something happening around the election. So either opposition takes some political action, or either there is some like protest or political event. The thing is that Alexander Lukashenko has been the president of Belarus for 30 years, and he's running for the presidency in 7th time. You can imagine this is not really possible by the democratic standards for a person to run 7 times in a row. Every single of this election was won by Lukashenko. Normally, he receives around 75-80% of votes. But, this is the reality of the Belarusian politics. In 1994, it was the last time that we had like a fair vote counting. The candidates which surround Lukashenko really don't matter because this is just the candidates who just make the impression that elections are happening. The recent elections was like the 2020 elections were this key pivotal moment. You probably seen the pictures, like 500,000 people on the streets of the Belarusian cities, Minsk, Hamel, Grodno. The repressions that have followed were like unprecedented. And the outbreak was unprecedented. The rage was unprecedented. As I have said, there were like 100,000 people on the streets. But the regime responded with a very hard manner, in a very hard manner. So they have detained thousands of people, like tens of thousands of people. And after that, international sanctions followed. And then there was the war in Ukraine, and actually we're still feeling the consequences of this political crisis in Belarus. What have changed since 2020? What to expect from 2025 presidential elections? The date of the elections was defined end of October. It was just before the US election voting day. And the date is also clearly aligned with the US president inauguration day, because as we have heard from the president-elect Trump, he is going to actively, very proactively be involved in the region, and he promised to end the war in Ukraine 24 hours. Although the special envoy to Ukraine is more moderate in his expectations, having said that there will be imminent 100 days for ending the war in Ukraine, like for Lukashenko, the signals during the election campaign in the US were actually a motivator to move the election date earlier. So if some talks around Ukraine, some negotiations will happen, he could present the country with a refreshed mandate. In that sense, he turned the page after 2020, saying that, hey, no matter what happened in 2020, this story is over. I'm a new elected president, reconfirmed by the electoral process, and I can represent the country on international level. So think of this as sort of the refreshment of his power or legitimacy, so to say. So the date is clearly aligned with the inauguration of the US president. It would be not far from the date. The second thing is that the election is a key point for internal politics, because from 2020, we have been facing an ongoing and constant repression against activists and against opposition. So to understand, there is no legal political activity for opposition groups that could be held inside Belarus. So opposition parties, political parties are banned. Their leaders are either in jail or in exile. The non-government organizations like human rights defenders, these organizations are all banned and expelled. There are like hundreds of them, of course, still working, but those who keep it quiet. So every one of those who are vocal, who do some statements, who try to do something actively, proactively, stepping into the realm of politics, is persecuted immediately. Since 2020, we're living that very reality. The open political work is possible only from abroad. And it's a bit constrained, because you actually cannot talk to people, you cannot gather together with the people, you cannot feel the situation in the country, you cannot communicate clearly, and you cannot organize the groups, right? So now with this election campaign, what actually happens, they are probing the environment. They also follow closely if there will be some protest activities, because they have been clearing out the space, the political space, for almost 4 years now. Even now, they're not sure that it will be tip-top, right? And what they need this very quiet and clear picture that nothing is happening, because they don't want any critical international reactions. They don't want any outbreak in the Western media. They want to keep it quiet, so the send the clear message that they control the situation in the country. And this is also a clear message for the internal government officials. So in that sense, this is a page turning also for the authorities, because they are stepping into a new era, the post-2020 era, and after 2025, after the new elections, you can say that what has happened 5 years ago is not more relevant. And in a sense, they're right, because I would say that there is a very high probability, almost a certain probability, there will be no protest activity in Belarus during the 2025 elections, and Lukashenko will very certain to win these elections. I expect these elections to be very quiet and very calm, with no surprises at all. One of the reasons is, unfortunately, a growing fatigue in the country, the general disappointment with the events, with the Russian invasion to Ukraine, the unsuccessful revolution 2020, because there were a lot of expectations from the political participation 2020, and when this mobilization ended and people understood that the revolution, the peaceful revolution, has failed, there is a lot of disappointment, disillusionment, and people are just turning to their day-to-day activities. They try to survive. They try basically to survive, and under the sanctions regime, around 300,000 Belarusians had been forced to move abroad. The population of Belarus is around 10 million of people, a bit less, so you can imagine this is a huge number, 3% of the population, the 3% of the workforce that had left Belarus. It also has a tremendous economic impact, and many of those who left there have been activists, and they're also the drivers of the political action. The regime was quite successful in working towards demobilizing people. This is not the first time the Belarus have faced a political crisis. I mean, in 1996, when there was a referendum in Belarus which changed the constitution and gave the president a lot of political powers, a lot of unprecedented political powers, and overruled basically the parliamentary authority, there were huge protests as well. A lot of people were arrested, but it's always like that. You mobilize, you try something, then you fail, then you're disappointed, but then you come back, you get back from your knees, and then maybe in 10, 15 years, you're ready to go again. But we're not still there. I think there are 5 years, 7 years, till we will have a real chance coming from the inside to mobilize people politically. There could be, of course, some other changes coming from outside, and I'm not talking about the controlled transition of the inside the regime with no actual democratization, but I mean, if we talk about internal processes, I would bet it will take around 10 years more at minimum to achieve some substantial regime change inside Belarus. But the question is that Lukashenko is facing much more challenge from the regional and international perspective than from the internal one. In 2020, 2021, 2022, maybe 2 years past the elections, the internal challenges were also a significant thing. But now there is no one really challenging from the inside. He's controlling the situation. The opposition in exile was heavily degraded, and the capacity for the action from exile is highly diminished. The media, which are not state-owned media, the alternative media, so to say, that had to go to exile as well after 2020, also have been facing a constant decrease in the audience. And while election process, it helps a tiny bit to improve his international subjectivity, his international image, it doesn't really help to overcome all his problems. And he has a couple of those, I would say. Maybe not a couple, maybe even a lot of those, because Belarus has been always a country in between the West and in between Russia. And Lukashenko has based his politics on balancing between those major powers. The international challenge is the biggest challenge. First, Lukashenko is thinking a lot about his role in the supposed Russo-Ukrainian, US-Russia, any format, that you can imagine, negotiations about a ceasefire regime or some, peace deal or something. Lukashenko would love to sit at the table and to negotiate on the Belarus behalf, because he's expecting to get some reliefs on the sanctions regime. And I would say that Ukrainians would be quite supportive of the idea, because if you talk about the rebuilding of the economics, so actually Belarus was an important trade partner for Ukraine before the war. They traded fossil fuels, and there is a railway connection from Ukraine through Belarus to the Baltics. So there is a lot on the plate that Lukashenko can discuss with the Ukrainians, and a lot on the plate that he can discuss with the US, the West, or whoever will be present on this table. So I think this is a basic idea: to get elected in January 2025, to refresh his mandate, to forget about a misfortunate campaign for him in 2020, and to try to negotiate something during this ceasefire deal or something that should be happening. And also to improve his international recognition and improve his subjectivity and improve his international standing. And then, after that, probably negotiate with the West about the release of political prisoners, and there are still plenty of them, around 1,300 officially recognized, to negotiate on sanctions, to negotiate on travel ban, the flight ban, which Belarus has since May 2021. The problem is that his position now is very, very difficult, especially because when Russia invaded Ukraine, part of the forces, they came from Belarus. So they used Belarus territory to attack Ukraine, to launch missiles. So that puts Lukashenko in a very difficult position, because he partially perceived as the one who assisted Russia and who committed an act of aggression towards the neighbor. Though Ukraine is not officially in the war in Belarus, and no one actually says that the war is happening between Ukraine and Belarus, but the implications of the Russian troops marching from the Belarusian territory can be felt a lot, especially when the US and the EU sometimes they harmonize the sanctions regime, and they have been in trend in the past year that the sanctions harmonizations take place. And that's also the problem of the sanctions harmonization with Russia, because in the near future, if the deal will be struck between Russia and Ukraine with the mediation of the US and I don't know what, so you would naturally want to have a separate sanctions regime, so you can tackle the situation in a more detail. So you can work with the Lukashenko regime separately and to try to redirect him so he will be less Russian-oriented. You can work with Russia separately, so you can do lots of things. If you don't distinguish, you just don't tease the country because Lukashenko is a bad guy, this is just makes Belarus being neglected. This is just makes Belarus non-important. So I think neglecting Belarus because Lukashenko is a bad guy is a very unstrategic diplomatic and political practice. Whoever the guy is, it doesn't matter how many sanctions are there. denying the subjectivity of the country, denying the subjectivity of a regional player is a very, very bad strategy. The opposition in exile, to my knowledge, I think doesn't really have any capacity to organize something substantial, to organize a substantial resistance. There is absolutely no possibility for any real alternative candidate to register him or herself as a candidate to this campaign. All the candidates are cherry-picked by the regime, and they possess no real threat to the main candidate. There could be some real action for the opposition if they could manage to organize something on the ground, but this is just impossible. Everything is very curated, everything is very clean, the space is really clean, so they have been cleaning out the space for 4 years as of now. Most of the most popular opposition leaders are in jail. Others who are more popular in the West, they just don't have this outreach. They just don't have these resources to mobilize anyone on any activity. So actually, it's quite a dire situation for the opposition. What have been done lately, I think, for the last half a year, when it was clear that 2025 election will be happening, the opposition groups have mainly focused on preventive unrecognition of the elections, which is, of course, a bit absurd activity, because you cannot actually legally recognize something not fair and not legitimate before it actually happened. So it's just not a feasible idea. But I mean, I think most of the international advocacy efforts have been around the unrecognition of the elections in 2025. There was a call from some members of the opposition to adopt the resolution by European Parliament for non-recognition on the election, and it just happened that they could not agree on adopting the resolution before the election day, and this is normally what you would expect. In terms of the EU reaction thing, and from the folks that I have been talking behind the scene in European Commission and External Action Service, so I think the EU is closely watching the elections, and everyone knows the regime in Belarus is not free, not democratic, but I think it's much more important for Europeans, at least, not to put any more problems on their plate. So what they're thinking, the way of their thinking, is like, we will see how it goes. If there will be no arrests, everything will be quiet. So probably it would lay some ground to negotiate with Lukashenko in the future about the political prisoners, about the sanctions, and maybe try to move him with diplomatic means a bit to a different direction. Because this is actually an opportunity you have. And of course, the context of war is very important, because while there is an open and conflict, the guns are firing, the people are dying, like tens of thousands of people are dying in Ukraine, civilians, military personnel. You cannot clearly be easy on those who do this. You cannot be easy on the closest Russian ally, who also, Belarus, who also helps Russia, who trades with Russia, who produces arms to Russia. There is also some speculations going on about that in 2 or 3 years, not waiting for another re-election, Lukashenko could probably step down and move to what is called People's Assembly. But I would say this is just a speculation for now. I would not rule out the option he will run for the re-election 2030. It's too early to say that we're having the sequence of events which lead to the transition of power. Obviously not from the Belarusian authorities to the opposition, but to the transition of power inside the political elites. The opposition has been discussing the most appropriate tactics for these elections, and there have been votes for, participation against. And actually, we talk only about the people who are in Belarus because after 2020, the regime has banned people living abroad to vote. So they not actually ban the people to vote, but they won't be opening electoral sites abroad. So previously you could vote in the Belarusian embassy whenever you leave, come and vote. And now all these sites are closed. There will be no sites for voting abroad. So to vote in the presidential election, you basically need to travel back to Belarus. And for most of those who are abroad, it is not appropriate. Either they're afraid because of political persecution, or either it's just expensive to travel if you live far, to have a transatlantic flight or something like that. And I remind you, we still don't have any direct flights into Belarus, so you need to fly into Poland, to Lithuania, and then hop in the car, on the bus, and spend 30 hours or so on the borders. So a normal person wouldn't do this just for sake of voting, to throw a ballot on the presidential elections. Some of opposition groups has been advocating for a boycott tactics. I would say this is an eternal debate in Belarusian politics. So ever since I remember myself, there have been groups advocating for boycott. There have been groups advocating for participation, the protest participation, different shades of that, and the boycott. So the problem with boycott that it really works when a substantial amount of people which boycott in the elections. And it actually works well when the election votes are really counted, surprise, because then you don't have enough turnout. But if the Electoral Commission can just put the numbers in and just say that turnout was 90%, and it doesn't really matter how many people there who were voting. Really, in Belarus, no one counts the votes. No one really counts the votes. So the system works, very simple, but very prone to, influence. So when international observers come to the local election sites, everything seems to be right. People coming in, they're coming out, they're showing their IDs, they're, throwing the bulletins in. Even when electoral commission, the local commission counts a vote, it could be fine, right? When the head of the local electoral commission, she publishes the numbers. These are numbers that are already coming from the Central Electoral Commission. So it doesn't matter how many bulletins for whom are in the bins. It's just the numbers which come from the Central Electoral Commission. What you can do, so you can do alternative vote count, and that's what we have exactly done in 2020. So we collected the information with the help of IT platforms. And this is how actually in 2020, it was shown with a very high probability that Lukashenko hasn't probably won the elections in the first round. It doesn't mean he totally lost. Often misconceptions on 2020 that, Lukashenko lost like big time. No. So even by the independent social polls, Chatham House is doing social monitoring. So Lukashenko has a constant support base of around 25% of people in Belarus. So even in 2020, he would probably, receive 25% of votes, which is clearly not enough to win in the first round because you need to have a majority of votes, 50% plus. And it's clearly not even closely compared to what was officially announced, 80%. So it doesn't really make sense to boycott because you'll be just easing in the life for those who, falsify the elections. They will see that people are not really interested. There will be less pressure on them when they count votes. There will be less pressure on them when they give you out the ballot. And it actually, statistically, I think if you see the research, they have been long ago defined by the research of the political theorists from empirical study that boycott just doesn't work. The usual sentiments against the participation in the elections goes that by participating in elections, you actually legitimize the regime. You show that the electoral process is important, that you know that you play the game the regime plays. I actually don't support this argument because for me, I think it's very, very important to practice political actions. It doesn't matter if the elections are rigged or not rigged, just the fact that you come from your house and you go to the electoral site and you throw the ballot. This actually trains resilience and it actually makes you remember what is happening in the country. And I don't think that it really matters if people participate or not participate. The regime will have legitimization from the elections anyways, because the elections will be held, the results will be announced, and the illusion of the electoral process will be created, and it doesn't really matter either there will be 3 million people coming to the sites or 2 million people coming to the site. It's not actually visible because we have 5 days of early vote before the elections. We have election day. We have a lot of voting sites. There are like no lines like you could have seen in the US to vote because we have a lot of voting sites. So it's not actually visible. It not actually contributes to any image or picture legitimizing regime. The regime legitimizes itself mostly by just existing. Yes, and it's right. Maybe it's a surprise, but it's not the elections which legitimize the regime, but the actual holding of power legitimizes the Lukashenko regime. If they would not have the power anymore, there would be no question of the legitimacy. So while, yes, of course, theoretically elections help in the legitimation process, but, this is not actually the main concern here. This is not actually what makes a regime relevant, but, the taxes they impose on the people who pay these taxes and the ability to influence the life of millions of Belarusians, that actually does matter. And if you stay in home, you don't do any political action, and this influences your psycho, this influences your mood, this influences your perception. So for me, it's really important to go and vote. You can go, against everyone. You can spoil the ballot. And by the way, this also holds for real democracies where they count votes. The turnout is a big issue. And actually, many unpredicted results from elections come from the low turnout and low interest in the politics from the people. So there have been a discussion, and I think what opposition have agreed upon. So they have agreed upon voting, going to election site, and voting against all of the candidates. And yes, we do have the option to vote against all of the candidates. This is the call from the opposition from exile to the Belarusians inside the country. The big question if this call really heard by Belarusians, because we don't really can be sure that a lot of people are really paying attention to the guidance of the opposition in exile. But still, there is a position there, right? So some of them, maybe 10, 15, 20% of very pro-protest, anti-Lukashenko people there will be listening to the tactics, and then they will go to the site and vote against every candidate, against all, so they say. And I think it's good. I think it's good that people will go, vote, see the Electoral Commission, see how it happens, and receive this experience of participating in not free elections. I think it's important, so in the future, you can compare it to your experience of participation in free elections, which I hope sometime will be held in Belarus. There have been also some speculations about Russian influence on Belarusian elections. I don't think this is the case as well, because normally Russia supports Lukashenko, and Lukashenko effectively controls the electoral process, so you don't really need any intervention from Russia to get predictable results here. Also, I think Russia has been very unsuccessful in creating pro-Russian sentiment in Belarus. I think the group that advocates for uniting with Russia is absolutely marginal Belarus. I think the latest social polls show that there are like maybe 1% of people, maybe 0.5% of people which support that Belarus will be part of Russia. So this is equal to a statistical error. So I think no Belarusian in the sane mind would advocate for that. The consequence is there is like no real pro-Russian politicians in Belarus, no pro-Russian parties, but actually we don't have a party system here, right? So parties are not really relevant. Most of these parties are pro status quo. They're not opposition parties, but we don't have any real pro-Russian party which are sponsored or founded by the Russian government. This is also important to understand. There were some verbal interventions from the Russians, some fake news and disinformation from Russian media that some resistance groups are preparing action on the election day. But I think this is just to irritate Lukashenko in some way, because for him, the 2020 was a big political failure also in front of Russia. Because what actually happens that no one had expected something coming from Belarus, and the Russians were pretty sure he was controlling the situation. And when the protests broke, it was a big surprise for Russia and Moscow as well that Lukashenko actually failed to control the electoral process. I think they're just teasing him and saying, so look, so if you cannot control your people, you can't control your territory, so we're happy here to help, but you need to understand that it will be at cost. And I think he understands it very well. Another question circulating maybe in narrow circles, I would say, because I'm as well part of a narrow circle of Belarusian activists and exiled, sentenced by the regime for 11 years in prison in absentia. I know this topic which is circulating. So there was a topic about the possibility of holding the alternative presidential elections by the opposition in parallel to the regime elections in Belarus. Yeah, so while this could be, a lucrative idea to hold something in parallel, the real situation is the participation degree in exile is really low. We had just had the elections to the Coordination Council. This is a horizontal body which represents activists in exile. I would say it's more a party-like structure. So it's a party-like structure for those who are around Tikhanovskaya and her headquarters in Vilnius. And we faced a great challenge mobilizing people for those elections. And actually only 7,000 of people have participated in these elections. So I would say, for example, for Tikhanovskaya, who was a technical candidate in 2020 elections, the legitimacy that she got participating in those elections, though formally, but accumulating the support groups of other candidates, Valery Tsepkalo, Viktor Babarika, accumulating the legitimacy which comes from the broad mass protest movement is much, much more than anyone could get now in exile holding any type of the elections. Even if 10,000 people would vote, even if 100,000 people would vote, it cannot closely be compared to what you can get inside the country with 7 million voters. It can't come close to what had happened in 2020 when 500,000 people went to the streets protesting against the election results and demanding to free political prisoners and to hold free and fair elections. So while this idea is interesting in theory, on practice, you just don't have enough resources, you just don't have enough people, just cannot reach a desirable outcome and improve your positions. And actually, by holding such elections, the opposition would actually diminish their position. They would show that actually the mobilization problem is very acute, and there is a disconnection between the target audiences. But the disconnection, of course, partially comes from external reasons, because most of the opposition groups, like all of them, are labeled as extremists inside Belarus. So when you interact in any way, if you follow a social media account of so-called extremist politician who is in exile, you can be jailed for that. So people receive real sentences for that. They go for 5-8 years in jail because they, like a Facebook post, they share the X post. What's really happening, that the regime had put a lot of effort into cutting off any alternative leaders who are in exile from the Belarusian target audience. So it's even unsafe to interact with those. Any platform you put in will be labeled extremist, maybe the same day, the day after, and the people would just fail the threat of being arrested for voting on this platform, and there will be definitely arrests, and they will arrest hundreds of people for that, and it will just make the turnout very low, and we also don't want to act in a way that it threatens people directly. So it's a very, very difficult situation to execute such an idea of alternative parallel elections. But why does the regime even wants to have elections? Why do even do these elections? Because you can say that now we have a new constitution, we don't need elections anymore, and let's make it easier. They're saying that we have a norm now. And this norm basically was propagated by the Western democracies. So to behave like an appropriate state, like an appropriate regime, you need to have some sort of elections. And most of the unfree regimes, regimes with authoritarian character all around the globe, even in Iran, Palestine, they have elections. Even in the Soviet Union, they have had elections, because it provides benefits also for interaction with the population. It helps to leverage the fact for the narrative construction. So you can say that we actually listen to people, we actually represent people, we actually have the mandate. You can also play the game of being a democracy if you want, if you need that, in the international arena, etc., etc. And in a sense, it also has this effect of the refreshment of the political season. You can say that it's a fresh start. We had a great or bad 5 years, depending on how you want to position it. And it gives a sense of fresh start. It's the elections of a previous head of state, I would say so, mostly guaranteed. But it gives this a very subtle sense of fresh start. And I think this is very important for the people who work in the government. It's important on the diplomatic arena because you exploit the norm. So, the diplomats, the foreign governments, they tend to perceive elections as a fresh start as well, because of their own electoral system processes. So they actually judge about you by their own experience. So doing, an extrapolation while the content is absolutely different. And of course, it also provides, even for the people who understand everything and they're against this is providing some sort of a milestone, a fixed milestone in the space, a count point. So whenever anyone starts to talk about Belarusian politics from January 2025, they would have to mention 2025 elections. Anytime, you then talk about the president of Belarus, you can say that he was recently elected. You don't mention 2020. You don't mention 2010. There were international sanctions after 2010, international sanctions after 2006. No one ever mentioned this in the current political discourse. Everyone is focused more on recent events. And this is how the the psychological aberration of history works. The people just tend to remember recent events much more vivid and much more than the events in the past, especially if those events are of the same category. So the recent elections are always more present in your consciousness than the last elections. This is a very important psychological point. And also, regime tests its ability for administrative control. So actually, they check how effectively they can mobilize the signatures, how effectively they can manage the candidates, how effectively they suppress the resistance inside the country, how effectively they control the media field. Because when you expect your adversaries to start doing political actions, and I mean the regime clearly expect that the opposition in exile will be doing something, so you check the real power and the real influence in the situation in the country. And this is a crash test, right? Because before the crash test, you can theorize, but you cannot understand the real situation. You can theorize a lot, but no one expected something to happen in 2020, but actually a lot has happened. And if nothing will happen in 2025, which I believe will be the case, so you actually say, look, yeah, we are in control. So this is an important message for the security forces, for the government officials, and all the people that, look, we are in control. Just compare what has happened 5 years ago and how it happens now. It's a striking contrast. So it's the contrast between 500,000 people on the streets and none of people on the street. And nobody challenges this from the inside. And I mean, there will be challenges, challenging, a constant challenging and call-outs from the opposition in exile. But the most important, the situation in the country is under effective control. And this what the regime wants to show. This was the regime, this message the regime wants to send to the West, to Russia, to everyone. And this is a pretty important message. Because as I have said, if you negotiate something, if you deal with Belarus, if you want something in Belarus, you talk to one that has effective control. You can support morally the opposition leaders. You can be sympathetic of those. You can be sympathetic of the heroism. You can be very sympathetic with those who were actually paid with their lives. And someone, they literally paid their lives for that, because allegedly there was from 11 to 17 people who have died during the protests in Belarus. So they really paid with their life. But when you need to solve an issue right now, when you need to solve an issue about the Belarusian border, you actually have to deal with those who are in power. Though it's a non-democratic power, they didn't get this power by free and fair elections, but they do have it, in contrast to those who just don't have it. In terms of international reaction, I think the US and the EU, I mean the European Commission and the European Parliament and some of the members of the European Union, mainly Germany, Poland, Lithuania, France maybe, the UK, the countries that they do have foreign sections working in Belarus, they do closely monitor the situation in Belarus. They're certainly preparing for the international reaction about the 2025 elections. I would say in general this reaction would be negative because, as I have said, you cannot have free and fair elections while you have political prisoners inside the country. This is just obvious. So the rational thing to do would be to release them before the elections, but it seems they just don't see this the time yet. We're still not there. And I think this is mostly because we're locked in as a country by the war in the Ukraine and the outcomes of the war in Ukraine, because how Lukashenko will act will highly depend on how the war in Ukraine will end. So I would expect moderate criticism from the international community. There will be statements about that those elections couldn't be considered free and fair because of the political prisoners and constant repressions and no freedom of media and freedom of journalism inside the country. But I think if the elections will be relatively quiet, I think we could see a suspension of new sanctions which are introduced from the European Union. So this could be the case because if the regime have started showing the signals that they acknowledge the question of political prisoners, and there will be some sign from the EU side about that. And of course, this is, as I have said, this is an important psychological point for the foreign officials as well, that there is a new season. If there are new elections in Belarus, 2025, that then the season of 2020s is actually over. There have been also a lot of stipulation about the Tikhanovskaya mandate. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was probably the most famous Belarusian abroad, and you probably might have heard of her because she was the only one who was registered to the elections, and all the other candidates' campaign headquarters have put their resources into her campaign to create this unifying protest movement. There have been, speculations about whether she still has her mandate after the 2020 elections, if this mandate finishes in 2025, or if it doesn't finish because the cadence is 5 years. But I think this is not a good framing because actually Tikhanovskaya doesn't have any mandate. She officially hasn't been inaugurated. Her political platform with which she ran for elections was a tactical platform focusing on the release of political prisoners and holding new fair elections. So actually, she doesn't have any mandate from Belarusian people to do what she does now, to call for international reactions, etc., etc. But for me, it really doesn't matter because Tikhanovskaya is just the most popular politician abroad. She's closely associated with Belarus, and it's good because we have a voice to speak for us on the international arena, a real celebrity, which most of the people know if they know about Belarus. So I think questioning the mandate is not a productive discussion because there is no actual mandate. The elections were not recognized. The official reaction from the international community was the non-recognition of the results. So there were no actual election results. No one has received the mandate. No one has won the elections. So, to speculate about the mandate is not a good framing to me, and I expect that even after 2025, Tikhanovskaya will still be the most cited political activist and the most cited person from Belarus in the Western media, at least apart from Lukashenko. He's been cited not less than Tikhanovskaya, of course, because of his real political power, because even autocrats are cited because they're relevant. So wrapping up, we shouldn't expect too much surprise for 2025 elections. It acts as a milestone and a focal point for internal political dynamics and also challenges the opposition movement and exile even more. And probably a lot of international actors will still perceive this as some sort of a new chapter to try to engage with the regime and to see if the situation will change, while obviously these elections will not be free and fair, considering that there is 1,300 of political prisoners still held in jail and ongoing repressions in Belarus. Like I said, I think it's probably a good idea to take a look with your own eyes on the voting site, to go for a walk and to vote and to participate in elections. As we joke in Belarus that most of the Belarusians go to the election site because of the buffet, because we have this tradition of having cafe So they serve coffee. They even can buy a sandwich, a salad, or something. So this is a Soviet tradition, actually. So they try to make some sort of a holiday from the election day. So you have this atmosphere, the positive atmosphere. You can even drink a bit, maybe a glass of sparkling wine or something right on the election site. If something will be happening which is not aligned to what we have discussed today, I will of course report on this, and we will get to the topic of 2025 elections. And I think I will also reflect a bit on this after they will end, and we'll see if the regime will take additional steps into signaling the West that they're ready to recognize the question of political prisoners. So probably you will be getting back to this topic from time to time. If you want to hear about some specific topics around Belarus or to discuss some specific topics, please write it in the comments. And also, please support Belarus, spread the word about Belarus, and stay informed. Please subscribe to the podcast, share it with friends, and stay in touch because we're planning to do really interesting stuff here. This is just the first episode, but I'll be also inviting some guests, the person I really know, the real political activists from Belarus, the experts in various domains that are very profound and very deep in the in what is happening in the region and inside Belarus. And also, we are picking up the topics which, from our point of view, are the most important, which are sometimes neglected by the broader media that you won't really hear from the major outlets. And also, we rely heavily on the inside information from the opposition in exile, because I personally visit all the meetings of the major political meetings that are connected with Belarus in exile. And I also follow all the events very closely from the beginning of 2020, because I'm also a part of the what is called opposition movement. In the further episodes, we will talk about Russia and the perceptions of Russia by the Belarusians, about the political prisoners and their condition, about the economic challenges that Belarus faces, the cultural identity of Belarusians, the Russo-Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, and how Belarusians perceive this war, what are the implications of this war for Belarus. So thank you for joining me on this inaugural episode of the Belarus Factor. Me, Ivan Kravtsov, it was an honor to share my thoughts about the upcoming elections in Belarus. Please subscribe to the podcast and support Belarusian people. You just heard Belarus Factor, a podcast about Belarus, and me, Ivan Kravtsov. Please subscribe to our social media channels, share with your friends, and support Belarusian political prisoners.